Hey folks, today we're going to be talking with my friend who is now graduated to Dr. Philip Sink, although I don't think he would want me to say that, about American pragmatism. I kind of situate this in a conversation of what are we trying to do when doing scientific theorizing, and he'll talk us through the origins of American pragmatism and how it connects to other elements of history in American academia, and how this connects to his own work in modal logic. Throughout, you may hear some funny noises, reverbs, etc. I made a big oops and recorded this on a leather couch in our graduate student lounge. So note to self, do not record on a leather couch. It will creak. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy and that this is can be informative to your own thinking or your own work. It certainly has been for me. If you could just introduce yourself, like what you do and what we're going to be talking about today.
My name is Philip Sink. I'm a PhD student in the philosophy department at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm currently wrapping up my 6th year. I'll be defending soon. My research is primarily in an area called modal logic, and in particular using modal logic to model what I would describe as signaling games, and to that end applications towards distributed computing, distributed protocols, that kind of thing. But we're not going to be talking about any of that today. We're going to be talking about something more traditionally philosophical. It's a school of thought, a favorite of mine, something that I've found genuinely inspirational and influential in my technical work. It's called American Pragmatism. It's the school of thought that most accurately can be said to be homegrown in America. All right.
Cool. Where do you want to start us?
Sure. So I think I want to start us actually so I have two broad sources for a lot of the history I'm going to be talking about today, which are, one is a book called The Metaphysical Club by Louis Menand. This is a fantastic, if you're the kind of person who likes to read history books at the beach, this is a fantastic fantastic one of those. It's a nice big thick book. It covers a really, really deep dive into a good chunk of the history of the American intelligentsia after the Civil War writ large. But that's pervaded with the development of pragmatism. These go hand in hand. And the other source is Cornel West's textbook. Cornel West, the American politician, civil rights leader, so on, is himself deeply intertwined with pragmatism. He was a very, very good friend while he was alive with the pragmatist Richard Rorty, and his West's PhD thesis was in philosophy on pragmatism. So he wrote a textbook called The American Evasion, and I have to emphasize it's not invasion, evasion of philosophy. And I like the place where West starts, which is he starts with the American poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, actually.
Really?
Yes, he does. He considers
That's an interesting starting place.
Yeah. There's really only one other canonical starting place, which we'll get to as the second figure.
But why is Ralph Waldo Emerson the starting place of American pragmatism?
So
for West, okay.
Yeah, for West. So the reason is because Emerson is the beginning of this idea that an American philosophy needs to be anti-tradition, anti-power, pro-individualism, and with Emerson somewhere buried in there is pro-democracy, but that's going to come up a little bit later. But like this idea that there's something significant about individual will in terms of, for Emerson, it's a lot of, the power of individual will in making our relationships. He has these famous essays on friendship to that effect. But Emerson is, you can think of him as the poetic source of a lot of the way American liberalism self-conceives, right? We're anti-tradition. We don't like appeals to this is just the way things are always done. The American liberal tends to conceive of institutions and structures as things that can constantly be remade,
and
constantly
liberal
be improved.
In the contemporary sense, or like liberty kind of liberal?
Liberal in both. Actually, I'm going to say
Okay.
You don't get Aaron Sorkin without Emerson. So liberty sense, but also definitely more so the modern, even the modern like professional, liberal of the Democratic Party, is still descended from Emerson, in the sense of, again, we don't imagine institutions as definitely the best. There's always the possibility of remaking something to be better. That we're opposed to strongmen. We like to disperse power among typically a group of people. We like there to be multiple leaders at any given time who can deliberate. We don't like power to be concentrated in any one place. But at the same time, very pro-individual, right? So very much so believing in the individual's freedom to choose. I mean, obviously, this manifests in the modern world as like choosing as a consumer, but also like the ability to choose what job you have, where you work, where you live, how you're going to live. That kind of individualism, and all of these things sort of have. They don't start with Emerson by no means, but they sort of crystallize in Emerson. And Emerson is going to be at Harvard. It's either Harvard or Johns Hopkins. I'm pretty sure it's Harvard. When a lot of the first people who are really pragmatists are getting their education and also developing the beginnings of their ideas. So he's very much so, like, I think of him as like the canvas on which is going to be painted. And we'll see, like a lot of those tenets, especially the individualism, are going to get, again, there's going to be revisions and changes as this history progresses. That's where it starts, but that's definitely not where it ends.
All right, so we have Ralph Waldo Emerson as West's starting point.
Yeah.
And so what he takes from Emerson is this emphasis on individualism, like you're saying, and then
also an emphasis on experience, I should say, like an emphasis on the senses as a source of self-creation, but also as a source of information.
Okay.
Which of course you also see echoes of in people like Whitman, and if we're talking poetry.
And then a strong skepticism of concentration of power.
Yeah.
All right. And then where does West take us from there?
The place where most people start.
Okay.
Which is Charles Sanders Peirce. So Charles Sanders Peirce he's getting his education just before the Civil War kicks off. He's because of his position, I think he's at the U.S. Okay, well, actually, should explain who Charles Sanders Peirce was, because he was many things over the course of his life. He was scientist, mathematician, logician, and philosopher. So he had training in chemistry. He had training in statistics. He didn't exactly have training in logic the way we would conceive it now, because he kind of invents it. And he also has training in philosophical history. He becomes, as a student, he's very enamored with Kant, people like that. And it's also worth stating at this stage, he's also just a virulent jerk. Okay. This is a recurring theme through his life. And he's a jerk. He's a jerk both like interpersonally. He seems to have been like impossible to be around at like a personal level, because he was just like constantly telling people they were wrong, how he thought they were wrong, posturing himself in that kind of way, but also just astoundingly racist. He says some absolutely horrific things. But this is where pragmatism starts. So he graduates, I believe, before the Civil War starts, and it's because he gets a job with the U.S. Geological Survey or the Beach Surveyor that he's exempted from the draft into the Union Army.
Sorry, the Beach Survey?
Yeah, so like Coast Survey. Sorry, Coast Survey. Okay. And he's doing research, chemical work, stuff like that for the USGS in this time frame. And it's shortly after this. It's fair. I guess not shortly. This is a fair bit after. I think there's a paper he writes called "How to Make Our Ideas Clear." This is actually part of a series of papers, and they're very, very interesting because their intended audience was not philosophers. The intended audience for these papers was actually chemists, or really scientists in general. But he's basically trying to say, he's using his philosophical chops, his philosophical training, to say, look, how should we go about doing science? Like, what does it mean to like effectively undertake science? And he starts by breaking down. So he's interested in this notion of clarity, and we're on the with the 19th century. We're on the tail end of, or just after the end of what might be called the modern period of philosophy, which is usually conceived to start with Descartes, and that's also implicitly where Peirce starts. So Descartes, you may know as the guy who said, "I think, therefore I am." Right, and this is actually relevant for where Peirce is going to be starting, because Descartes' like, well, I think, therefore I am. There's something about that sentence and what that sentence entails, the fact that I exist, because I can't doubt that I am thinking. To doubt that I am thinking requires that I am thinking. He calls it clear and distinct. And so he's able to get from those, he thinks that you can build up from the clear and distinct ideas an understanding of the way the world works. He's going to doubt his way all the way back to that which he cannot doubt, and then rebuild his understanding of the world.
Very much like Descartes.
No, I'm describing Descartes.
Oh, okay.
Peirce thinks this is asinine.
Oh, okay. I was a little confused there for a second.
Fair enough. No. This is Descartes.
Oh,
correct.
Okay.
Very much like Descartes, because I'm describing Descartes.
Got it. Okay.
Peirce thinks this is, it's hard to overstate the degree to which he hates this. The paper, he's making fun of it. Like, he's not just saying it's wrong. He's lambasting this idea.
Okay.
He's like, the idea of doubting, like, the basic tenets of your experience is childish, basically. Like, there's nothing sensible about this. You can't do it.
Somebody the other day was calling it sleepover philosophy. It's like the kind of thing
Peirce would be on board. He would absolutely be like, no, this is not worth taking seriously. This is a very silly. And to any folks listening who are Descartes scholars, this is obviously a massive oversimplification and misunderstanding to some degree of Descartes' project. But to the extent that doubt is a part of Descartes' project, and also starting from clear, distinct ideas as a distinct project, Peirce is like, neither of these are tenable. You cannot doubt, basically. But just like it's very Humean in the way he's thinking about this. It's like you just have to live in the world. And so doubting from your armchair like that is completely artificial. That can't help you as a scientist. But also the clear and distinct ideas might be themselves a bit misleading. So he calls them the first degree of clarity. And we're going to build up to 3.
Okay.
So he basically is like, clear and distinct ideas are just like, you look at it and you're like, yeah, that feels clear to me.
This is Peirce now.
This is Peirce. He's describing the clear and distinct ideas. Right. Look at it and you're like, yeah, it feels clear to me. And it's like, great. That's where we start. But there's plenty of things that feel clear to us, that feel like they have significance to us, but they don't. And there's a recurring example, probably the best, there's a lot of examples he uses in the paper, and probably the best one is the notion of hardness. And this is, again, you can see he's talking to chemists, talking to scientists. So obviously if I say yeah, that glass bottle over there is hard, you know what I mean. And the sense in which you know what I mean, first principles, that's clear and distinct ideas.
Okay.
But that's not good enough for the scientist, and Peirce is aware of this as a scientist. So there's a second thing you try to do. You try to define it. You try to put that idea in terms of other ideas that seem clearer. So for hardness, are you aware of like the chemist's hardness scale and how this works?
The first thing I'm thinking of is the Mohs hardness scale.
Good, that's the one we're going to be talking about.
Okay.
So why don't you tell us how the Mohs hardness scale works?
Well, my understanding of the Mohs hardness scale is everything's just relative to a diamond. So diamond is 10. What's 0?
I don't, probably something like water. Water's a mineral. I mean, it is. But it's not necessarily, diamond is a 10. But it's better to think of everything as relative to each other. Right?
Right. Diamond, pinpoints that one end of the
diamond
scale.
Pinpoints one end and is relative to each other. Exactly.
Okay.
And then of course there's how do we get those relative distinctions?
Right.
Well, what you do is you want to know, I mean, again, we're talking this as a relative scale. We've anchored numerical values by fixing certain things that we are aware of, like a diamond, to certain numerical values. And that helps us give numerical values to the other things, but it's all relative, right? So if I'm going to say that something's a 9, it has to be less hard than a diamond. What would that mean? Well, take thing, right, and take diamond, and you just scrape them against each other.
I love this. It's so ridiculous.
This is it. This is still how the Mohs hardness scale works to this day. Whichever
pretty wild.
one scratches the other is the harder. So the diamond won't be scratched, presumably, and that gets you towards that. So that would tell you that like the softer thing is less. And as you're refining out the scale, you might make other anchor points to other numerical values, or you might need to shift things around a little bit. Again, it's about understanding what's harder than what, not like, and the numbers are just to help clue you into like where they live in that relative space.
So strictly speaking, it's actually an ordinal scale.
Yes.
That we're giving a continuous value.
Exactly. That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So
okay, and how does the Mohs hardness scale?
This is a definition. This is a definition now of hardness. And it's even better than maybe a definition. It's a definition with a practice. So it's a definition that we know how to use. Right. And so that gives the scientist something further, and they can use it. And this example is really, really helpful, I think, for Peirce's point, because obviously, like a chemist who've been working with hardness can see, oh yeah, so that's where there's the notion of the thing, but that's not sufficient. As a scientist, I'm used to this process of like creating definitions, putting things into their specific place, and then refining out. Not refining out, but then going from there towards my conclusions. But remember, I said there were 3 degrees of clarity.
Right.
And this is only number 2. And this is the one that I think the scientists are most familiar with. And this is also the first one, if you look at Peirce's tone, this is the first one that he like respects. He's like, definitions are great, but they aren't enough. And I'm going to motivate why with a thought experiment. And this is also Peirce's thought experiment. And it's great that you already brought up diamonds, because diamonds are actually a part of the thought experiment. So Peirce says, imagine a thing that looked like a diamond. It interacted with everything, every sort of device we could use to measure it. Like it reflects light like a diamond. It has mass, the same density as a diamond, that kind of thing. So it interacts with the world exactly like a diamond, except it has the following conceptual distinction. A diamond, of course, when you scrape things up against it, the diamond wins the fight, right? Mm-hmm. It scrapes the other object. This new thing that we're describing, that's like a diamond in every way, except this one difference, which I'm going to call from this point forward, this is not Peirce's word, this is my word, but I think it's useful to have a word for it. The jellystone.
I love the jellystone.
The jellystone. The jellystone has the consistency of jelly until it comes in contact with another object. Sort of like a non-Newtonian fluid, but very extreme.
Okay.
Right? And so you can imagine, right, like if you pick it up, it'll seize up. And it'll become just as hard as a diamond. It'll scrape other things like a diamond. But when it's suspended, you can think like in a vacuum or something. It just so happens to have the consistency of jelly.
So you could never experimentally verify that it has this jelly consistency.
This is the important thing. There's no experimental process you could do that differentiates the jellystone from the diamond. This is exactly the thing when I teach this to my students that they try to hedge. They're like, well, could I like tell the difference this way? And it's like, no. And if you've come up with something clever, we have to add it to the thought experiment. Because the point is, there can't be any way of experimentally differentiating the two. Mm-hmm. We have this conceptual distinction. One exists in the world a certain way, and the other exists in the world the other way. They are differently described. And so we conceive of them differently. But there's no experimental thing we could do to tell them apart. And this is what Peirce says is the 3rd degree of clarity. If you can't tell them apart experimentally, if there's no practice now or in the future that can tell 2 things apart, they're the same thing. Mm-hmm. We basically, for the mathematically inclined, we quotient. We take our ability to create clear definitions that we can use in practices, but then we contract. We say, well, if there's no practice that can tell these 2 things apart, even if I can describe them differently, they must be the same thing. And there's something, and we just discard the conceptual differences from description. So the jellystone and the diamond for Peirce are the same thing. This is the important thing here. There's nothing different about the jellystone and the diamond because there's nothing we could ever do to tell them apart.
And what, again, is the motivation for this? Because I'm thinking that there are some things that we might think to be the same, but then we can also provide different descriptions for it, so we can break apart
We do this all the time, and sometimes to great effect, right? Like sometimes definitions help us tease apart differences that we didn't realize were there, like on the first degree of clarity. That's fine. But then, if there's nothing that we can do in practice to tell two things apart, so once we have some definitions and some working categories that are giving us some traction, we then bring practice into it, and this is where pragmatism gets its name. It's pragmatic. If there's no practice that can tell two things apart, the pragmatic choice is to not worry about it.
So is there another example than the Jellystone of like a...
Sure. Probably the most compelling example. So Peirce is living in this environment where there was a long-standing debate as to whether or not forces arose from inside. So like think about the gravitational force. Does it arise from inside a planet and like reach out and grab the other planets? Or does it sort of like exist between the two? There are different ways of talking about forces. And what Peirce said is, look, on the way Newtonian mechanics functions and on the definitions it gives us, all of these different ways of talking about forces are the same. There's nothing there's nothing we can do as of yet to test them apart. And eventually, arguably, I don't know to the degree to which I quite like this. Certainly the language of quantum mechanics gave us new ways of thinking about what forces are and where they come from. That's definitely true. You could say maybe it vindicated some conception of forces over others from that 19th century period. More plausibly to me, and I think this would be more plausible to Peirce, it gave us a new way of talking about forces that we didn't even have before. Hence the quotienting by, like, these are just all talking past each other. They're making distinctions that we can't test was very reasonable. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. So now we have Peirce's three
degrees of clarity. And pragmatism is the third degree of clarity. Pragmatism is the recognition of the third degree of clarity, let's say.
Okay.
And this gives him, and this is the other, there's another really important piece then that comes out of this, which is like Peirce conceives of scientific truth. So historically, philosophers have conceived of truth as extending from the real. And this is sort of where we started. Remember, we were talking about analytic, like sort of the general analytic mode. We believe that there are ground truths, and it's our job to figure out what they are. So what is true depends on what's out there, what's real. Peirce flips this. He says that's backwards.
Okay.
He says, look, what we have is our modes of inquiry. And these are going to, if we do a good job and we're reasonable, these modes of inquiry are going to converge. Whatever they converge to, that's what's real.
Okay.
So we have this ability to inquire into truth. That's this third degree of clarity, science, these practical tools. And they're going to converge. Like they're going to like build on each other and sort of narrow. And whatever they converge to, that's what we will call what's real. There's nothing more to what's real than whatever is the end point, the infinite end point of inquiry.
Nothing more to what's real. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I always have a hard time placing people in the realist, anti-realist conversation.
Peirce is not an anti-realist the way his successors will be.
Interesting. Okay.
So he's basically unwilling to say more about the real than it is this end point of inquiry.
Okay. And why do his successors want to go further than that?
We'll see.
Okay.
We'll get there. We'll get there when we get to his successors, right?
Okay.
But there's this convergence notion. And for those in the audience who might be thinking, if this sounds a lot like a Bayesian convergence to the truth theorem, you would not be the first to make that analogy. Teddy Seidenfeld in our department, this is why he has Peirce, a portrait of Peirce up in his office, is he thinks of Peirce as not prefiguring because he's after Bayes, but like a true scientific Bayesian in this sense.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's the convergence is guaranteed by the mode of learning, and that's the other thing that's nice, right? It's guaranteed by for Peirce, right? Like the proper doing of science, which the Bayesian would cash out as the use of Bayes' rule to update on novel information.
And Peirce thinks it's guaranteed.
Yeah.
Okay. I see why that would make him some form of realist.
Yeah.
Whereas if you might think that it's maybe not guaranteed, but in a direction, it would, you're weaker on that degree. All right. So where do we go after Peirce?
To his student James. And this is one of the people who is going to push back exactly on this idea of like, is the convergence guaranteed? This is exactly where the doubt starts to seep in a little bit.
And what time frame are we talking now?
We're still after the Civil War. So James is going to be around until the very, very beginning of the 20th century. So is Peirce. Peirce actually outlives James a little bit, which is a little bit relevant to their biographies. More than a little, it's very relevant to their biographies. We're still in this like end of the 19th, early 20th century time frame.
Okay,
and really end of the 19th for where most of this work is going to go. So James is if Peirce is a chemist, or is getting his understanding of learning and inquiry from the physical sciences. It's worth noting that William James might be just as well known to psychologists as he is to philosophers. He's often called the father of American psychology. And his textbooks on psychology, I believe that there are still places that use them as like the intro psych material.
Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
Like he develops a huge amount of the landscape of psychological practice. At least, especially in the American context. He is not a Freudian or a Jungian. He's a pragmatist, as we'll see.
And I can see how here your views on epistemology and the practice of science would be really influential in how you go about thinking about a field like psychology.
Exactly. So, and James is there's this it's simple. It's oversimplifying to say that he's going to latch on to this like convergence notion, and that's where his doubt's coming from. His doubt's coming from a bunch of places in terms of Peirce's thought. He is also he is Peirce's biggest fan though for his whole life, and this becomes very, very relevant. I remember I said Peirce was a jerk.
Okay.
In the last half of his life, Peirce could not hold down an academic job to save his life.
Oh wow! That much of a jerk, or were there
that much of a jerk?
Okay.
There's definitely evidence that there were people who probably unreasonably disliked him, and that pushed him out of Johns Hopkins. But he ends up living in, I believe it's Pennsylvania somewhere, with his second wife, and he can't even afford paper, often can't afford heat in the winter, and James starts up like a fund, like he passes around a hat. I think James is at Harvard, basically just like to keep Peirce afloat. Mm-hmm. And this fund continues after James's death, and that's where it's relevant that James actually ends up dying first. James also has his own incredible history. There's this amazing photograph of him. He looks exactly like a cowboy. It's hard, like, but with sunglasses. Like, it's hard. It's impossible to overstate how cool James looks in this photo. And this was when he was doing some surveying and, I believe, collecting specimens in South America during his time as a student. There's also great stories about James getting like high on nitrous oxide. And James, if Peirce is kind of a disagreeable, stuffy jerk, James is the cool one.
Okay.
James is.
I had to know.
Yeah. James is very, very I'm trying to think. Cool. I mean, there really isn't a better word than cool. He's just cool.
I'm gonna need to find this photo.
Oh, it's so beautiful.
Cowboy.
It's a classic. Yeah, it's a classic.
All right. And where does he take pragmatism?
Right. So I'm going to focus on the rough outline of an argument that James makes in a text called "The Will to Believe," which kind of the name of the text sort of gives away the game a little bit here. Mm-hmm. Roughly speaking, there are kinds of... James is very, very... I'm going to back up slightly. James is very influenced by Peirce in terms of this idea that, like, if you look at this idea of Peirce, this third degree of clarity, which Peirce calls the pragmatic maxim, if you look at, like, what that's really giving us, it's basically saying, like, our definitions only matter in so much as they have, and James's phrase would be cash value. Mm-hmm. And he's using that, a little bit glibly. He doesn't literally mean like I can get money from it. but he wants there has to be a practical import to any category that we're using. It has to matter to a practice and to a mode of living. It has to make a difference to you, basically, for it to count as a real distinction, as a real philosophical tool, to have any philosophical teeth.
Mm-hmm.
But James is going to note that there are situations where cash value can be a bit circular. So the example he would give is you might have this is the classic example. This is right at the top of the Wikipedia page for Will to Believe. Is you might have to believe yourself capable of completing a task before you're actually capable of doing it. You might have to pump yourself up with the confidence to do it. Say like, yeah, I could do this.
Fake it till you make it.
Little bit of that, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so there's something circular going on there, right? Where like the functional value of the belief, and this is the other difference that James is going to give flavor-wise to Peirce. Peirce is very interested in like carving up the natural world. He's thinking like a physical scientist. He's thinking like, okay, what are the different definitions and ways of carving up the natural world that are going to pay off? James is a psychologist, and he's going to generalize this. He's going to say, what are our beliefs? What are the beliefs that have value and purpose and are useful to us? And he notices this possibility of like sometimes you can basically, it becomes a true belief and it becomes a useful belief that you're capable of doing the thing only if you, on a strict view, like irrationally adopt the belief in the first place.
Okay.
You see?
I'm a little lost. Is there like an example or something that we can use to ground this?
Back to the idea of like, maybe, imagine yourself as a little kid trying to jump off the high dive.
Okay.
Right. You want to believe that you can, or like you want to do it. You want to, get over the fear and
right.
Jump 16 feet into the water, whatever. But the only way that you're going to get yourself able to do this, able to work through this, is to believe that you can in the first place. You have to believe in yourself. So you have to irrationally adopt a belief, or arbitrarily, maybe is a better word. Arbitrarily adopt a belief.
Okay.
But then it self-reinforces.
It's like it makes once you've jumped off the high dive the first time,
or once you have the belief, you'll be able to do it. Once you have the belief, it'll actually make the belief true.
Right. Okay. And then how does this tie into maybe less personal beliefs, something
good,
scientific?
Well, the one of the big things that James is interested in the will to believe is faith, and he thinks that faith operates on the same principle.
Spiritual faith.
Faith. Yeah.
Okay.
Spiritual faith. So a belief in the divine. Peirce is very atheist. Mm-hmm. One of his examples, actually, in How to Make Our Ideas Clear, of like beliefs that don't definitions that don't have practical distinctions, is transubstantiation versus consubstantiation of the Eucharist. Like, is it actually the body and blood of Christ, or is it just like metaphorically? And he's like, there's no real difference here. That's silly.
Uh-huh.
And of course, this is a distinction that has caused wars. So again, he's thinking about practical difference when he thinks about the pragmatic difference as a physical scientist. James is thinking more broadly in terms of belief. And so he's very interested in understanding, like, why do I have faith? And this is another sense in which we get these like echoes of like a lot of very early Americana, kind of like through Emerson. The earliest American philosophers, people like Jefferson, Adams, they're deists. They believe in a higher power, but they don't believe that higher power has any interest in the affairs of mortals. It's like sort of set things in motion and disappeared.
Uh-huh.
James is not quite a deist, but he's certainly not a true believer in the sense that we imagine him, because he thinks of faith. He sort of turns faith into one of these very personal belief kinds of things, where he's like, if believing in a higher power works for you, then there is one.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not, I want to be clear here, he doesn't necessarily, this is where things get kind of messy with James, at least as I find with James, is he's not individuating the notion of truth. That would be an over caricature. But he does think that like a belief working for you, like functioning for you, is part of its total cash value in a way that someone like Peirce is not.
So in this example, say, having faith, if that
Yeah.
causes you to do certain things that are influential in your life, then he's saying that gives it truth.
Exactly. That's right.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So that's so the shift from I think of the biggest importance with James in terms of the history of pragmatism is this shift from, if Peirce is front loading the notion of cash value, that like we want to like develop our philosophy in terms of like what functions practically. James is acknowledging that we can and should broaden our notion of like the things that have cash value away from just, you know, scientific categories, physical scientific categories, towards beliefs in general. We need to shift all the way out towards the things we believe. Those are the things that we actually have to be evaluating it.
I see. So he takes Peirce's idea and then is expanding it to more beliefs, because the physical scientific beliefs are not the only ones that exist.
I don't necessarily want to say Peirce is like strictly on the physical scientific thing. I mean, he invents logic, basically. You know, if you go to most philosophy departments, they would tell you that Aristotle invented logic, but logic as we do it today, especially with quantifiers, really has its first home in Peirce, before Frege, like the decades before Frege. It's quite remarkable. And if you look at the work of people like Russell, you know, for those logic heads out there, if you look at the work of people like Russell and Whitehead and Principia, it's pretty clear that they're, you know, they acknowledge Frege, but it's also very clear that they're heavily influenced by Peirce, and they're not acknowledging Peirce to nearly the same degree. A professor of mine in undergrad was almost conspiratorial about this. He's like, look, the order of the axioms as Russell presents it in the Principia is the same as the order that Peirce presents it in his work. He has to be getting it from Peirce. I have no reason not to believe this. So as a Jamesian, I choose, you know, I will myself to believe that, you know, Peirce really is the progenitor of basically, you know, really the starting point for most of modern logic.
Interesting. Okay, so where does James take us from here?
Right. So I think now's the time for our third character, actually.
Okay.
I actually think we should talk about my favorite of the big three, John Dewey.
Okay.
So John Dewey, so if Peirce to James is a teacher-student relationship, John Dewey is outside of that. I'm going to start John Dewey actually after his education in Chicago, where he is in Chicago during the Pullman strike, if you're familiar with that piece of American history. So the people who were assembling the Pullman train cars, these sort of like fancy high-end train cars, all of them went on strike. This is one of the great moments for Eugene V. Debs. He's one of the voices sort of leading this strike, trying to create this notion of American socialism. And John Dewey is in Chicago while all this is happening. He's a huge believer in the strike. And there's a great correspondence between him and the, I guess the most general word is the philanthropist, Jane Addams. Not the Jane Addams you're necessarily thinking of, two Ds. She will eventually create the sort of collective housing cooperative called Hull House. That's very, very famous in Chicago history. In U.S. history. Where Dewey is, you know, there's great letters between Dewey and his wife, and Dewey and Jane, where he's talking about the strike, and every time he talks about the rich and the role that the rich have in terms of eventually they, you know, violently put down the strike, and it doesn't quite achieve its aims. And every time he writes the rich, he's like, parentheses, damn them. But and I'm getting this more from Menand than I am from West. There's a real sense, though, in which the strike is very disillusioning for Dewey. Like there was a path where
the aftermath of the strike.
The aftermath of the strike. Right. There's a path where Dewey could have basically become a socialist, and the failure of this strike pushes him, shall we say, elsewhere. Not off the left. He remains a committed leftist. But not like a Marxist revolutionary socialist type figure. And this is where he develops I think one of the takeaways he maybe has from this event is a belief that so this is a thing we see with both Peirce, actually less so with James. With Peirce, one of the things that's necessary about this guaranteed convergence is it is a cooperative of scientists working on this. Right, they're sort of he is kind of imagining a little bit of a checks and balances thing. I think he would imagine if it was just one scientist. I mean, certainly the Bayesian Peirce imagines if it's just one scientist, there's still convergence. Right. But Peirce is aware of there being a collective. James, we've already seen one way in which he's sort of injecting a little bit more Emerson in. Right, he's more mystical. He's more focused on belief. But he also individuates it a little bit more. Again, like we talked about, the individual cash value of beliefs. Dewey is going to push strongly on the other direction on that. Dewey is the champion of democracy, democratic thinking, so cooperative type thinking, and is really going to emphasize that you can't make sense of the value or the practical import of beliefs or of definitions without embedding them into a kind of contextual discursive practice. And again, if we're thinking of Peirce as the physicist, maybe, the physical scientist. Right. And James is the psychologist. Mm-hmm. Then Dewey is the biologist.
Interesting.
Yeah. And this isn't a bad way to look at it. Dewey is heavily influenced by Darwin, for example. So Dewey's very interested in thinking about our perceptive organs as evolved. And given that they're evolved, they're contingent, and they're not little truth seekers, right? They're just adaptive, right? Whatever our eyes and our ears and all of these other things are doing, they're not, they're contextualized by the world. They're of the natural world, the rest of the world around us. But there's no reason to imagine them as tools for discerning the true nature of reality. What they are is adapted organs that serve a certain functional purpose. And you can only understand then the nature of our experiences, the nature of the way we relate to reality in light of that kind of context. And this generalizes. So all of our ability to understand sort of the content of I keep using this phrase discursive practice, but like the content of either a conversation or a group of scientists collaborating is in virtue of the context in which that event is happening. Everything has to be contextually understood in order to be made sensible. And in that way, also, contexts involve groups of people. That's where the democratic component comes in, right? You can't make sense of anything without relating yourself to other people. There's no way to break out of this without, a conversation requires two people. But even just for any kind of scientific enterprise to function, it needs multiple people, back and forth things, sharing and refining. And again, it's the context of that practice that determines the kinds of things it uncovers. And so, and this is now very different than that original analytic picture, right?
Right.
Where we started was, we're going to use our tools to the best of our ability to uncover the way the world is. We've now completely flipped that on its head. Whatever the way the world is, it simply determines the context by which we can best understand what our practices are doing and how they're being successful and what they're uncovering. So that is, there's a great quote, actually, that I want to read from Dewey that's sort of on this. Do you mind if I...
Oh, go ahead.
All right, cool. So, like James, we're going to be talking about... So I'm going to preface this quote a little bit. So like James, we're going to be talking about experience. Right? We're talking about sort of the way... for James, this is belief. But the way that we encounter the world. But Dewey is going to say, right, well, this is contextually constrained, it's biologically constrained. And he's going to take that towards, so you might say, typically we think of experience as a thing that happens to us. Dewey is going to expand experience, though. He says, if it's contextually constrained, there's more to experience. And now I will get into the quote. So, Experience is primarily a process of undergoing, a process of standing something, of suffering and passion, of affection, in the literal sense of these words. The organism has to endure, to undergo, the consequence of its own actions. Experience, in other words, is a matter of simultaneous doings and sufferings. Our undergoings are experiments in varying the course of events. Our active tryings are trials and tests of ourselves. Nothing can eliminate all risk, all adventure. The obstacles which confront us are stimuli to variation, to novel response, and hence are occasions for progress. If biological development be accepted, the subject of experience is at least an animal, continuous with other organic forms in a process of more complex organization. An animal, in turn, is at least continuous with chemico-physical processes which, in living things, are so organized as really to constitute the activities of life with all their defining traits. And experience is not identical with brain action. It is the entire organic agent-patient, all in all its interaction with the environment, natural and social. The brain is primarily an organ of a certain kind of behavior, not of knowing the world. And to repeat what has already been said, experience is just certain modes of interaction, of correlation, of natural objects among which the organism happens, so to say, to be one. It follows with equal force that experience means primarily not knowledge, but ways of doing and suffering. Knowing must be described by discovering what particular mode, qualitative, unique, of doing and suffering it is. So the point there is we typically conceive of experience as something we suffer. And we don't mean this in the negative sense. It's just experience is something that happens to us. And Dewey is saying, no, if we are biologically contingent organisms, experience is both. It's both a thing we do and that happens to us. It exists within that total context of how the experience organ evolved. And so
the experience organ being the brain.
The whole nervous system, including the eyes, ears. I mean, it's a total holistic.
Right.
Right.
And what does it mean to be contingent here?
It's dependent on the environment. It's dependent on the context in which it evolved. But this means it's also a practice. Like experience is something we have to also, when the organism is getting sense data, it's also interpreting it. So that's the doing, right?
The interpretation is the doing.
The interpretation, among other things. But the parts the parts that the organism actively plays in the process of a photon bouncing off of the leaf and hitting our retina, and then how that becomes what we typically call experience. That's the doing component. So you can see doing and suffering, very, very important there is the dichotomy. And so this is what leads, so the thing Dewey is probably most famous for is not necessarily his philosophy of mind and his philosophy of experience. It's actually his philosophy of education.
Interesting.
Yes. He's known for, you could basically think of him as the founder of learning by doing. That's the simplest way to put it.
Okay.
He was a huge emphasis on you cannot learn just by suffering, to use the language of the quote. You have to do. You have to, so if you, if you want to understand ecology, you can't just sit in the classroom and be given some facts about ecology. You have to go out into the woods and see it.
And what time period was he again?
He's developing a lot of this in the very late 19th century and early 20th century. So he actually dies, I think, at 54. He lives to a very ripe old age. Mm-hmm. But he's developing a lot of this around that turn of the century thing. He founds, there's a name for the school he creates in Chicago for children. I'm blanking on the name, unfortunately, for it. But it's built around his philosophy of education where, you're thinking like, you have to get hands-on experience in order to learn. You have to, the things have to, and this is to put it back into the language of the pragmatic maxim, the things you're learning have to make a difference to you. They have to make a difference to your experience, then to bring it back to the language of Dewey. Right. For them to stick.
It's interesting to think that this is something that he's a proponent of. I mean, nowadays, this is just like bread and butter in terms of
Dewey
pedagogy.
won. I mean,
yeah, but I'm having to remind myself that wasn't always the case.
Absolutely.
That for a long time, people thought that you were just like
you just get
fed
presented
information and
you retain
then you
it.
learn.
Yeah. Dewey really is ground zero for this idea that you have to retain information via it impacting you in some way, it making a difference for you in some way, it making a difference for your experience in some way. And again, I'm using all of that language just sort of so you can see the influence of Peirce, you can see the influence of James, and now you hit Dewey, and you hit this idea. And so if Peirce gave us the beginning of like flipping the real and the true, that like we're going to focus on our mode of inquiry and ignore what our mode of inquiry can't differentiate. James is then pushing that to belief. And Dewey is maybe finding a middle ground where he's like, let's talk about experience. And so he's very empiricist. He's you might say more scientific than James in that way. But again, you can almost think of it as like this middle ground where it's like we're not just saying that like, any belief that works for you is good, which again is a huge caricature of James. But we're also not just focused on like, we're purely disinterested scientists taking in facts about the natural world. There's something in between, and that's where Dewey tries to live.
Mm-hmm.
And I think lives quite successfully. I mean, I said before, Dewey is my favorite of the three, and that's definitely the case. And so you have to, we're evolved organisms. There's nothing about us that can be thought of as just like sort of like a pure inquirer. We're a part of the natural world, and we're made of the natural world. And the organs that we've developed in order to survive are merely that. And so in order to make sense of anything that we're doing, we have to think of it as contextually located. The broadest sense contextually located ecologically, but we can narrow down for each individual practice. And so that gives Dewey the beginnings of a flavor of pluralism, that like, we might reasonably say that like one mode of talking or one kind of truth is reasonable for one discourse, but maybe not for another. You get the beginnings of that. Dewey very famously thought, this is another sense in which he's pulling away from James. Dewey basically thought that doing philosophy of mind was impossible, at least in the present, with the linguistic tools we had available to us. He's like, look, if you're going to do inquiry into the mind, we just do not have the right language yet for talking about the mind in a sensible way.
Do we now?
Well, we're pretty much still working with the same language, so he would say no. To quote another great pragmatist, Dewey would say no.
Who says that?
Richard Rorty.
I see.
Which I guess is good enough a segue. He was the last pragmatist I was hoping to bring to the table. So we've had this idea. So we've refined out scientific truth to belief to experience. What Rorty is going to add to the table is Rorty is starting his philosophical work in the early 1950s. Or even actually the late 1950s, early 1960s. It's probably more accurate. So there's this long window of time. The usual story, and I actually don't believe this story for a few reasons, but the usual story that gets told is in early 20th century American philosophy, there were two kinds of philosophers. There were either people who did logic or people who couldn't hack it in logic. Logic is being developed, with great significance in the first part of the 20th century through people like, Hilbert, Turing, Zermelo, people like that. And so within the American Academy, the story that you often hear is something like, you either could hack it in logic and you did logic, or you couldn't hack it in logic and you did pragmatism. And there was a clear hierarchy.
What does this say about you, both a logician and a pragmatist?
Well, I also don't believe this story is true. Quine became quite famous and was explicitly a Deweyan, despite all this. But again, the way the story often gets told is like out of this environment, you get Richard Rorty, who certainly Richard Rorty does reinvigorate pragmatism. Mm-hmm. Through the beginning of the 20th century, the logical mode of inquiry, quite rightly, is seen as having had extraordinary success. The logical project there—that's where computer science comes from. Like I don't want to undersell how significant the development in logic in the first part of the 20th century is. Mm-hmm. But entering into the 1960s, Richard Rorty is going to sort of give pragmatism a revitalization. He's going to sort of give it a boost again. And the way he does that is, so one of the things that logic had really, really benefited from is the analytic mode of philosophy had transitioned to really thinking of itself in terms of language. That what they're doing is trying to refine our modes of speaking. This is downstream from things that people like the logical positivists said, is we need to think of good philosophical inquiry as finding like the useful ways of talking. I'm not going to say useful because that sort of betrays my own opinions, but the effective or in some contexts like truth-seeking, like the ways of talking that are best going to let us do the analytic thing, like get at the underlying reality to the extent that we can. But it's language now that we're thinking in terms of. We're thinking in terms of how do the ways we talk latch onto the world. This is the context in which the beginnings of like formal semantics for natural languages to being developed, starting with people like Frege and Russell and things like that. And so that has a huge influence on Rorty. And Rorty's going to bring language then into pragmatism. He's going to say, Rorty is very much so a Deweyan. He's gone through the whole, he like me sees Dewey as the best of the three. He's going to say, look, so what we're going to say though is, if we're understanding these things as contextual, we're also going to understand them as linguistic practices. Mm-hmm. We're going to understand these things as, and this is where, with Dewey, I kept using the phrase discursive practices. This is really a way of talking that I'm getting from Rorty and from Rorty's students. Mm-hmm. Dewey doesn't necessarily talk in terms of discussion. He talks really in terms of experience and biology. And so Rorty is going to say, look, we can think of this in terms of language, and then we can think, right, like, going back to the degrees of clarity, let's say, right? We can think of a lot of, like, so if there's Rorty, like the positivists before him, thinks that there's a lot of philosophical talking that really kind of amounts to nothing, and especially like Platonic talking. So talking as if like there is such a thing in a universal sense that we can understand as what a chair is a good example. Right. That there's a fact of the matter about what is and is not a chair would be a really good, like, sort of like simple truth to sort of get.
And that fact exists through all time, everywhere.
Or at least it exists insofar as you have people who know the word chair. And what Rorty is saying is this is just sort of, it's a thing our brains do where we basically fetishize the universal quantifier. Mm-hmm. We think that we can do things with our language that we really can't. And the other thing that Rorty is going to attack is he's going to go back to Dewey's critique of philosophy of mind and our ability to get at mental categories. And there's this really, really funny story. This is coming out of one of Rorty's books, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, that Rorty is a story about what he calls the Antipodeans. It's an alien species. And this species speaks entirely in terms of neural states. They don't express things in terms of what we would call emotions or experiences. They speak entirely in terms of like configurations of neurons. And at first, the philosophers are very, very excited about this because they're like, oh, this becomes a way of testing our best thoughts about like where does consciousness come from? Are Antipodeans conscious? Because now becomes a question. And slowly but surely, the philosophers realize no amount of experimental work that they do actually gives those questions any teeth. And so Rorty makes a very Peircean move. He basically says, like, look, if there's no distinction between talking about, if we cannot tell an Antipodean apart from a person, someone who talks entirely in terms of neural states and someone who talks entirely in terms of emotions, then there's nothing to be said for our conception about, there's nothing to be said for the weight we give on the concept of consciousness that can really have any teeth. So we need to move on. And this is the other thing that Rorty's quite infamous for. He's basically saying philosophy needs to move on. There's nothing about these modes of philosophizing that's really going to get us anywhere. There's like worrying about, well, where does consciousness come from and how does it work? Well, it doesn't seem like we yet have the language to even know that we're asking a question that we could ever, in practice, tell apart. It seems like both sides always have the ability to hide in the corner no matter what sorts of empirical information we have, there's always a way out for each side of the debate. And so maybe it's not a real debate. So that's a very Peircean flavor. But it's in terms of linguistic practices. We're saying, like, do we have the right words to talk about the mind? And Rorty's going to say no.
Interesting. Okay. And he's directly thinking about philosophy of mind in this
Absolutely.
case?
Rorty, more than any of the other pragmatists, is directing his critiques towards philosophers, which might make him the least pragmatist of the three to some degree. Right? Peirce is talking towards physical scientists. James always has his eyes set squarely on psychologists, and Dewey. Dewey's engaged in Darwin, and so I do like to think of him as engaged with biologists and ecologists. Rorty is engaged with philosophers. And there's a very reasonable sense in which, well, maybe you have missed the pragmatist charge in that sense then. But what he's basically doing, infamously, is he's basically telling philosophers none of what you're doing is going to work. This isn't going to go anywhere. We need to rethink how we're conceiving of this discipline. And I have, for what it's worth, I'm a huge fan of Rorty's, but I have mixed feelings about each of his particular assessments of different critiques he gives of philosophical projects. I think I largely agree with him on a lot of the philosophy of mind stuff, but there's other areas where I definitely don't necessarily agree with Rorty saying that this will never amount to anything. Nor do I agree with a lot of the way Rorty tends to positively describe philosophy, where he just kind of imagines us, all sitting in a room, continuing to read Plato because that's what we've always done. That doesn't strike me as interesting either. I wouldn't want to do that, to be quite frank. So Rorty becomes, but Rorty is very, very important for like where pragmatism is now, because pragmatism continues to find itself at odds with a lot of the present philosophical academy. It tends to be the ones questioning whether or not the kinds of questions we're asking in philosophy are really going to go anywhere, whether or not the kinds of practices we're engaged in as philosophers are really the right ones to be engaged in, whether or not these are the ones that are going to bear fruit, whether or not these are the right questions that we should be spending our time on. Philip Kitcher quite recently wrote a book, What's the Use of Philosophy? He's self-described Deweyan, very big in the philosophy of science, philosophy of biology. Just doing exactly this. It's right there in the title, right? He's questioning, like, why are we engaged in the philosophical practices that we're engaged in? Are these really liable to bear fruit? And to be blunt, he got a lot of criticism for this book, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. So that's where pragmatism sort of finds itself in a lot of cases nowadays, is in this business of questioning what philosophy should and should not be doing. And a part of me thinks that's a shame. Because again, if you look back to what the early pragmatists are doing, they're bringing philosophy outside of philosophy. They're bringing philosophy towards scientists, towards people who are practicing, trying to get at the world, and they're trying to, on the one hand, change philosophy, change how we conceive of philosophy in light of the success of those practices, but also use philosophy to comment on how we might do those practices most efficaciously, most effectively. If I were to make a charge, this is the place that pragmatism should be focused on. It should be focused on this interdisciplinary work to the best of our abilities. I think interdisciplinary work, philosophy has a lot to contribute in interdisciplinary projects. And there's a lot that interdisciplinary projects can do to make us better at philosophy. And that, I think, is where the best pragmatist projects these days are coming out. And I said at the beginning of this, right, I mentioned, yes, I'm a modal logician who is interested in signaling games and how they apply to computer science. Well, here's how I conceive of pragmatism influencing my own work. I think that the purpose of philosophy should be to augment other disciplines, but to let other disciplines then augment the way we do philosophy. It should be to communicate with people who are engaged in some other practice and to figure out how to improve that practice, who are engaged in some kind of model making or scientific inquiry or whatever it may be, and to think about what does it mean to do what you're doing well? That's a philosophical question. How can I comment on doing it better? That's philosophy commenting towards the other. But what does the fact that you're succeeding tell me about how I think about the way the world works and the way inquiry works. What does another discipline's success tell me about our ability to make sense of the world around us? That's another discipline informing philosophy. And that, to me, is the soul of pragmatism. It heavily emphasizes interdisciplinary collaboration. It does not see philosophy as the foundation of our ability to inquire. Philosophy is more like the glue that holds things together, or the mortar between the bricks. Philosophy is the practice of trying to understand how and why different modes of inquiry are successful, and not to try to ground them.
Mm-hmm.
It's engaged with people who are succeeding in making sense of the world on their level, not deferring to them, but also not trying to give them foundations or something like that. It's trying to, again, meet them where they're at.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely making me think, like you mentioned, your work in modal logic and signaling games, and I'm starting to begin my work in how we can conceive of agents, which of course it's itself kind of closely related to signaling games and computer science. And sort of in the back of my head, I have this conversation of philosophy of mind going on. And it's very interesting to hear the perspective of pragmatism in this conversation, because I feel like in the practice of trying to draw distinctions on, say, what agents look like, there's a sense in which there are some statements we can make about what an agent is that just cannot be measured, whereas there are others that we can observe. And so I certainly have been, in doing my work, following the guidance that it's the stuff that we can observe and measure that is worth at least spending my time on. I mean, I don't think that means that that's all that is true, but I think that means that it's the only thing that I feel like I can make progress on.
All the pragmatists would say, in addition to that, is if that's all that you can make progress on,
that's all.
It's not just that's all that's true, but it's like, why even worry if whether or not that's all that's true?
Yeah.
If that's where the rubber's going to hit the road, focus on that and don't even worry about the rest of it. And maybe if we truly open our minds to, you're talking about philosophy of mind there. Maybe if we truly open our minds there, we can finally have the language for describing the mind, the kind of thing that Dewey was hoping we would have by now, rather than be stuck in many cases with a lot of folk psychological terms.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Philip.
Yeah.
This has been great. I feel like now I want to have another conversation with you on the response, like criticisms to pragmatism.
Oh, sure, yeah.
This has been fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.